The legacy and voices of our ancestors is a foundation we can stand on and be inspired by today. Please like, share, and subscribe. If people can look at the sound of freedom and see how evil and disturbing and horrible human trafficking is, why do these same people have such a hard time looking back on slavery in the U.S.? Human trafficking that's legal and went on for generations. Why do they have such a hard time looking back on that and seeing it as evil and disturbing and horrible? Slavery in the U.S. was exactly the same thing that's portrayed in the movie Sound of Freedom. And yet we look at Mr. Ballard in the movie, we see him as a hero. There's no kind of ambiguity there. But then we look back in our own country at John Brown the abolitionist, and people have a hard time seeing him as a hero. Instead, they think of him as crazy or an extremist. How is it extreme to want to stop the kind of thing we see in Sound of Freedom going on? The answer is it's not. The truth is our minds have been groomed if we grew up in this country, if we lived here, to try to look back on slavery and not see it as it was. To see it as something much less evil than it was. See it as something run-of-the-mill. And there's no honor that we should bestow on the people who own slaves in this country. They shouldn't have military bases and schools named after them. This is horrible, slimy, evil stuff. We should move away from that. We shouldn't still be there after all this time. Why are we fixated on this still? I've been the apologist for people who did things like this. Sound of Freedom really exposes and brings to light how horrible this whole venture is, how evil, how satanic it is. We're talking about human trafficking of children in the U.S., which is something that doesn't come out too often. It isn't talked about enough because they're trying to cover up how horrible what we did is. But often children, even little babies, were sold as commodities here. Can you imagine the trauma that parents go through when something like that happens, when your children are taken away from you and sold as commodities, just like in Sound of Freedom? As society, we should face up to that. Think of all the trauma these people went through back in those days. And that's not even the worst of it. We never got over it. We never moved on. We never gave reparations. Instead of repenting of what we were doing, this human trafficking that was legal and an affront to every political philosophy we embrace, we kept going. We doubled down. We had Reconstruction. We had Tulsa riots. We had Jim Crow. We just kept going. We never stopped. And now we have these modern attempts to look back on slavery and act like it wasn't horrible. I was disgusted by Matt Walsh's claim that somehow slavery was a good thing, that it helped the descendants of slavery. Nobody would look at Sound of Freedom and look at what these people went through in that movie and then turn around and look them in the face and go, oh, this was a positive thing for you. What a disgusting thing to say. And why do we tolerate this from anyone? Why isn't Matt Walsh shut down? Why isn't somebody confronting him and telling him, you idiot, how could you say something like that? Instead, it just kind of just flies by like it's nothing. So many conservative supposed commentators talk about how slavery wasn't so bad. It's like a new trend that's come up. But I'm going to give you Sound of Freedom as evidence, because this is detached enough from our personal feelings that we can look at it and see how evil that it actually was and how disgraceful it was. And these modern attempts to try to look back on slavery and act like it wasn't horrible, they're a lie. We still need to repent of this as a society and face it for what it was. And stop trying to walk away from what we did and act like it was okay somehow.